I have taken vows to maintain peace in these lands. For you, I'm willing to make an exception.
Do you hear that? The depths are whispering something to me. It's about you. What's that? I see. They said, "Stop clicking on Pike, you monster." Amazing.
Among those who study the fall of House Stormsong, a common belief holds that the sea betrayed them, that the Tidesages were faithful servants of a gentle power, and that some darker thing crept in from the deep, wearing a familiar voice, and turned their devotion into ruin. It is a comforting story. It asks nothing of the faithful. It places the wound entirely on the outside, where no one need answer for it. But the record does not quite support that comfort. The corruption of Stormsong Valley was not a door broken down in the night. It was a door that had stood open for the better part of 27 centuries, propped wide by the very thing the Tidesages had always called their highest virtue. They had listened to a voice rising out of the water since before Kul Tiras had a name, and in all those long generations, not once had they built within themselves the means to ask whether the voice deserved to be obeyed. So the question that matters is not how the darkness found its way in. The question is quieter and far more unsettling. What becomes of a people whose entire faith is built upon obedience when the voice they have sworn to follow begins, slowly and without announcement, to lie? I am Keeper Aldrich. In my youth I studied among the Kirintor in Dalaran, and in the long years that followed, I walked the ruins of this world with the Explorers League, kneeling in the dust of civilizations that no longer remember their own names. Stormsong Valley is not the oldest history I have chased across this world, but it may be the one that most deserves to be understood rather than merely mourned. For its tragedy was not something done to it. It was something it had been carrying patiently and proudly from its very first day. To understand how an entire people could bow so completely before a voice, you must go back to before there was a valley at all, before there were Tidesages, before there was a House Stormsong, or a hull ever blessed against the hunger of the deep. You must go back to the water itself, and to the desperate men and women who first mistook it for salvation. The story begins in Gilneas, on the mainland, roughly 2,700 years ago, by the reckoning that survives. A group of humans, restless, dissatisfied, unwilling to accept the lives their homeland offered them, left everything behind and took to the ocean. The chronicles describe them as seeking a greater existence, a phrase vague enough to hide 100 private hungers. Whatever they were fleeing, and whatever they hoped to find, they found instead the open sea, endless and indifferent, and for a long while it offered them nothing but distance. They scanned the horizon by day and by night, searching for a place that married land and water, somewhere they might shelter their children from the waves that had swallowed so many wanderers before them. And it was in that stretch of hopeless searching that one man among them heard something the others could not. He was the ancestor of what would become House Stormsong, though he had no house yet, and no name worth remembering to history save the one his descendants would carry. The whispers came to him first, gentle, nearly imperceptible, a voice woven into the sound of the water that reached his ear alone. The accounts call the source of that voice the Tide Mother, and whatever she was, she taught him. She showed him how to guide fish into the nets of a starving people. how to call fresh water from a world of salt, how to bend the wind into the sails so that the ships moved when there had been no movement, and how to make the hulls of those vessels impenetrable to the things that swim in the darkness below. His power grew, and as it grew, others began to hear the voice as well. The wind became theirs to command. The sea, which had been an enemy, became something between a servant and a god, and at last the Tide Mother's whispers guided them home, to an island cradled by the ocean on every side, a place they would name Kul Tiras. The man who had heard the voice first claimed the northernmost region for his own, a green and storm-swept stretch of coast and farmland, and he named it in his own honor, Stormsong Valley. The travelers, weary and delivered, felt at last that they had reached the greater existence they had crossed an ocean to find. There is something in that founding worth naming, beneath the gratitude and the relief. These were people saved by a voice they could not see, could not verify, and could not question. Salvation had come to them through a single man's willingness to listen and obey, and it had worked. The nets filled, the wind rose, the land appeared. When your survival is purchased so completely by unquestioning trust, doubt does not merely feel unwise. It feels like ingratitude. It feels like betrayal of the thing that saved your children. And so the founding virtue of this people was not courage, though they had courage in abundance. It was not cunning, though the sea demands a great deal of it. Their founding virtue was listening, obedience to a voice. That was the seed planted at the very root of their civilization, and across the long ages that followed it would grow into something magnificent and something terribly fragile, both at once. There is one more thing worth noting about that founding, and it concerns a choice the Kul Tirans made that set them apart from the rest of humanity. On the mainland, in the kingdoms, these exiles had abandoned. Mortals had begun to look toward the light, that radiant, answering power that rewards conviction and belief. But the people of Kul Tiras did not look upward. They looked down into the water. There is an old saying among them that captures the difference precisely. The light rewards conviction, but the ocean demands activity. The light asks you to believe and answers your belief. The sea asks nothing of your certainty. It asks only that you act and listen and obey its rhythms without argument. A drowning man does not debate the tide. He surrenders to it or he dies. That distinction seems small at first. It is not small at all. A faith built on conviction contains somewhere within it the possibility of examining what you are convinced of. A faith built on obedience to a voice contains no such thing. It has no organ of doubt, because doubt was never part of the covenant, and that, more than any old god, more than any whisper from the deep, is what would one day leave the Tidesages defenseless. For a very long time, none of this looked like weakness. It looked like the foundation of a kingdom. The order that grew from that first listener became known as the Tidesages, and the scale of what eventually fell can only be measured against how much they held up. They were not a quiet monastic sect tending to their own devotions in a corner of the realm. They were the load-bearing pillar of an entire maritime civilization, and Kul Tiras could no more have existed without them than a ship could sail without a hull. Their function reached into nearly every part of Kul Tiran life. They blessed the ships, and on an island nation whose survival was written entirely upon the sea, a blessed ship was not a superstition. It was the difference between a fleet that returned and a fleet that vanished, They commanded the weather, calming storms that would have shattered lesser vessels and summoning wind when the sails hung slack. They guided the great fleets across waters that would have claimed anyone navigating by chart and stars alone, and they tended the dead, giving to drowned sailors and departed kin the rights that a sea-bound people hold sacred above nearly all else. When Borealis was only a scattering of houses clinging to a rock, it was the sea priests who made the city possible at all. Any Kul Tiran child who heard the whispers of the Tide Mother, for the gift was never confined to a single bloodline after that first founder, was sent north to Stormsong Valley to join the order. There they came to a place called Azshj'thul, where they studied and learned to master command over the sea. Every Tide Sage, before receiving the Tide Mother's blessing, walked the ceremonial path of storms, a road of devotion that led them at last to the great shrine of the storm. The order maintained a sizable monastery in Borealis as well, a place visitors could reach only by boat, as though even its architecture insisted that all things worth knowing came by way of the water. The order was not a formless congregation. It was structured and disciplined, and from what survives of its workings, we can reasonably piece together a mastery divided into three aspects, each devoted to a different facet of the elements. There were those who spoke to the waves themselves, the wave speakers, who could bend the water to their will. There were those who called the wind, the gale callers, whose blessings drove the fleets and whose power over the tempest could raise a storm or still one. And there were those who hardened the hulls, the iron hulls, whose runes and rites made a Kul Tiran ship a fortress against the crushing dark beneath the surface. Above all of these presided a leading council, and above the council stood the head of the order and of the noble house it served, Lord Stormsong himself. For House Stormsong was one of the four great houses that ruled Kul Tiras, and its seat was the Shrine of the Storm in the heart of the valley. The other houses had their own domains and their own strengths, but the particular gift of House Stormsong was singular. They built the kingdom's navy. Every warship that gave Kul Tiras its dominion over the waves passed, in some sense, through their hands and their blessings. To hold House Stormsong was to hold the beating maritime heart of the entire nation. There is a detail here that the Tide Sages themselves treasured, and that in hindsight carries a weight they could not have felt at the time. The Shrine of the Storm was protected by three great wards, spoken of as gifts from the sea itself. Their names were the Tide Mother's Wrath, the Tide Mother's Pride, and the Tide Mother's Radiance. For generations, these wards had guarded the Kul Tiran flagships against even the fiercest storms the ocean could raise. They were proof, in stone and enchantment, of the covenant between the Tide Sages and their patron. The sea had given them protection. In return, they gave the sea their unquestioning faith. It seemed a fair and holy bargain. Set at a distance, the true shape of that arrangement becomes visible. An entire kingdom, its fleets, its commerce, its defense, its very ability to feed itself from the water, rested upon a single order's connection to a single voice that no one outside that order could hear or verify. The strength of it is obvious. It made Kul Tiras a naval power without equal, a nation that walked upon the sea as though it were land. But strength of that kind carries a shadow, and the shadow is this: when everything depends upon one thing, then the whole depends upon that one thing remaining true. The Tide Sages had become a single point upon which a civilization balanced, And a civilization balanced upon a single point does not need to be conquered. It only needs that point to turn. For most of Kul Tiran history, it never occurred to anyone that it could. The voice had always been gentle. It had saved them. It had made them great. Why would it ever become anything else? That question was never asked, because the entire structure of their faith had been built precisely so that it would never need to be. And it is in the silence where that question should have lived that the whole tragedy of Stormsong Valley was waiting. Because the voice did change, slowly, and no one had ever been taught what to do when it did. The Tidesages themselves noticed it first, though they did not understand what they were noticing. The whispers that had guided their people for centuries, gentle, patient, imperceptible to all but those attuned to listen, began to shift in character. They grew demanding. Then, in time, they grew violent. The voice that had once asked only that its faithful listen now began to ask for things, and the things it asked for grew darker with each passing season. To a people whose entire spiritual life was the discipline of obedience, this was a catastrophe for which they had no defense whatsoever. The shape of the trap is plain enough. For 2,700 years, their faith had consisted of a single act repeated across countless generations. They heard the voice, and they did as it said, because doing as it said had always been right. There was no ritual of refusal among them. There was no rite for testing whether the voice was still the one they had sworn to serve. Such a thing had never been built, because in all their history it had never once been needed. And so when the voice turned cruel, their only trained instinct was the one that had been ground into the order since its founding. They listened, and they obeyed. At the center of this stood Lord Column Stormsong, the head of the house and the order, and here the record complicates the comfortable story considerably. For Lord Stormsong's fall was not, at least in its beginning, the simple hijacking of a pure heart. There was a grievance in him, and the grievance was old. His order fed the entire kingdom from the sea. His house built and blessed every ship that gave Kul Tiras its power. And for all of this, he had come to feel they received nothing worthy in return. The Tidesages labored endlessly in service to a nation that took their gifts as its due and offered little back. When the voice from the deep began to whisper of a different arrangement, of power, of recognition, of a Kul Tiras that would belong to those who truly sustained it, it did not have to break down a wall of virtue. It found a resentment already waiting, and it fed it. That is the terrible efficiency of what happened here. The corruption did not need to make Lord Stormsong evil. It only needed to take a real wound and offer it a voice that promised to make it right. And the man had spent his entire life being taught that when the voice speaks, you obey. He turned to the void, and he did not turn alone. His inner circle followed, his council followed, most of the order followed. An entire order that had defined itself by the discipline of listening now listened to something that had learned to sound exactly like the thing they had always trusted. And once fallen, they set about a betrayal so vast that its scale was hidden even from the kingdom it targeted. The great fleet of Kul Tiras had gone missing. This was known and mourned and quietly set aside, with the realm choosing to focus on building new ships rather than dwelling on the loss of the old. But the truth of that vanished fleet was worse than any storm. From the shrine of the storm, the corrupted Tidesages kept up a ritual, a working of dark power that trapped those wayward ships within a shroud of unnatural storm and darkness. The fleet was not lost, it was imprisoned, and Lord Stormsong meant to deliver it, whole, into the hands of a new master. He and his followers had bound themselves to Queen Azshj'thul, the ancient ruler of the Naga, and through her to the deeper power that stood behind her, one of the old gods, patient and vast, whispering from the crushing dark at the bottom of the world. Here I must be careful, for the record itself is uncertain, and I will not pretend to a knowledge the sources do not preserve. The exact nature of the Tide Mother remains a genuine mystery. The Tide Sages worshipped her across the long ages without ever seeing her clearly. Some have supposed she was a great water elemental. Some have wondered whether she was a kraken, given how thoroughly the imagery of the deep and its tentacled dwellers saturates every wall and banner of Kul Tiran architecture. And there is a darker reading, which the record raises but does not confirm, that the gentle voice and the cruel voice were never truly the same being at all. That Queen Azshj'thul, or the power behind her, may have been impersonating the Tide Mother, slipping into the place of a trusted god the way a wolf might wear a familiar coat. It is not hard to read the Tide Sages' own words as a clue, for they insisted the voice had changed. And we may reasonably suppose that a people who never learned to question a voice would not notice when a different one quietly took its place. Whether the Tide Mother was always false or was true once and then supplanted, the outcome was the same. The door had no lock, and something walked through it. What that something did to them can be read upon their very bodies. As the corruption deepened, some of the fallen Tide Sages ceased to be entirely human. They became the Kathir, twisted, aquatic things, their forms warping toward the shapes of the deep they had surrendered to. It is a horror with an old echo, this transformation of devout coastal folk into something monstrous and fish-like, and any traveler who has read widely will feel the shudder of recognition. The body followed the soul. What they had become on the inside, creatures who obeyed the deep without question, began at last to show on the outside. Devotion, taken past all reason, had rewritten them into the image of the thing they served. And yet, and this is the turn that saves Stormsong Valley from being merely a story of ruin, not everyone listened, not everyone obeyed. In the very valley where the whole tragedy had been planted at the founding, so many ages before, there rose a resistance, and its existence poses the sharpest question of all. If the entire people had been shaped to obey without doubt, then how did any of them find the strength to refuse? They gathered in the town of Brennadam in the heart of the valley, and they called themselves the Storm's Wake. They were not, for the most part, priests or nobles. They were farmers and craftsmen, soldiers and militia, the ordinary people of Stormsong Valley, the ones who had tilled its fields and worked its shipyards while the great house pursued its holy work above them. Among them stood uncorrupted Tide Sages as well, those whose faith had somehow retained the one thing their order had never taught them to keep, the capacity to say no. The members of the Storm's Wake came to be called the Awakened, and the word is worth sitting with. To awaken is to come out of a sleep. It implies that the ordinary state of things had been a kind of slumber, a long, comfortable unconsciousness of unquestioned obedience, and that these people, alone among their kind, had opened their eyes. Their fight was desperate and largely their own at first. As House Stormsong abandoned its ancient duty to protect the valley, threats crept in from every side, and those who tried to enter Stormsong Valley from beyond were turned away at its darkened borders. The storm's wake took up the burden the Tidesages had dropped. They fought Stormsong loyalists. They freed men and women who were being forced to labor against their will in service of the corruption. At the heart of that resistance stood a Tidesage named Brother Pike, one of the Order's own, a man who had kept his oaths when his brothers abandoned theirs, and who took upon himself the grim task of uncovering the darkness gripping his own people. Step by step and battle by battle, he pushed toward the shrine of the storm and the rotted heart of it all. He did not do it alone. Help came from beyond the valley, from figures who would matter greatly to the wider war. Among them, Talia for Dragon, who led much of the effort against Lord Stormsong and his cultists across Stormsong Valley, and an emissary who came in the name of the Alliance. There is a particular grief buried in this part of the record, and it belongs to a man named Samuel Williams. He was neither priest nor soldier, only a laborer from the shipyards, one of the many dragged into forced servitude by the corrupted militia and then freed by the resistance. When his chains were struck off, he did not retreat to safety. He threw himself into the fight with a fury born of vengeance. And when the confrontation came at last to the Shrine of the Storm, Lord Stormsong did not merely strike his enemies down. He seized Samuel and corrupted him upon the spot, twisting a rescued man into one of the faceless horrors of the deep, a thing the record names Azshj'thul the Drowned. It is one thing to read of a villain slaying his foes. It is another, and colder, to read of one who takes a good man and unmakes him into a weapon before the eyes of his allies. That was the nature of what the Tidesages had bound themselves to. It did not simply kill, it converted. It reached into the faithful and turned their faith inside out. At the shrine itself, cornered and unmasked, Lord Stormsong revealed the full truth at last, that he had fallen under the sway of Queen Azshara and the power behind her, and that he himself had been the one shrouding the missing fleet in darkness, keeping it hidden until the day it could be delivered to his new masters and turned against the very kingdom that built it. Then he slipped away, teleporting from the confrontation, forcing his pursuers to chase him deeper into the shrine and through the legions of his followers. In the end, the Tidesage Council and Lord Stormsong himself were struck down. It was not vengeance that demanded their deaths so much as necessity, for as long as they lived, the fleet remained imprisoned, and the whole kingdom lay within reach of the deep. And when it was over, Brother Pike performed a ritual to free the captive fleet from the storm that had bound it. The working succeeded. The ships were released from their dark imprisonment, but he could not call them home. He understood in a moment of humility that says a great deal about the difference between a servant of the sea and the house that ruled the realm, that summoning the fleet back to Kul Tiras was not his to do, that this belonged to House Proudmoore, to the true rulers of the realm. It is recorded that in the aftermath, standing amid the wreckage of an order 27 centuries old, he gave voice to a single anguished thought, wondering aloud what they had become. It is, I think, the truest question anyone asked in that whole sorrowful chapter. Not who had done this to them, what they had become. I walked the shores of Stormsong Valley once, in my years with the Explorers League, long after the worst had passed. The wind there does not rest. It comes off the water in long gray sheets and carries the smell of salt and rain even miles inland. and the old kraken carvings still stare down from the eaves of houses whose builders are gone. It is a green and grieving country, and the sea that made it has never once stopped whispering against its rocks. So the question returns to where it began, though it has changed its shape in the telling. What becomes of a people whose faith is built on obedience when the voice they follow begins to lie? The answer, written across the whole history of Stormsong Valley, is that such a people has no defense at all, not because they lack courage or virtue or love, for they possessed all three in full, but because the one thing they were never permitted to practice was the very thing that might have saved them. It would be easy and wrong to make Lord Stormsong a simple villain and the Tidesages fools. They were neither. Their devotion was real. It was generous. For 2,700 years it fed a kingdom, sheltered its children, carried its dead to rest, and drove its ships across an ocean that would have swallowed anyone else. That is what makes their fall a tragedy rather than a mere crime. The corruption did not have to defeat their faith. It did not fight their faith at all. It simply walked through it, because their faith had been built from its very first day, without a threshold, without a lock, without a test, without any permission to turn to the voice from the water and say, "This is not the one to whom we swore." This is the quiet warning the valley leaves behind, and it reaches far beyond the shores of Kul Tiras. There is a kind of devotion that strengthens the one who holds it, and there is a kind that hollows him out. The difference lies not in how much you believe, but in whether your belief has room somewhere within it for a single honest question. A faith that can ask whether its object is worthy remains free even in its worship. A faith that cannot has already surrendered. It merely awaits the moment when something notices the door has been left open and decides to come in. The valley endures. In the aftermath of the fall, the leadership of House Stormsong passed to Lord Stormsong's nephew, a man named Brannon, who took up his family's name unstained by his uncle's ruin and chose to work arm in arm with the storm's wake, deferring to the very people who had risen against the corruption. The order survived, changed, humbled, its great sin written into its history for all who come after. And in the wider war, the fleet these events concerned would matter enormously, for it was in this same season that Jaina Proudmoore rose to become Lord Admiral of Kul Tiras and led her nation back into the alliance of the world. The Tidesages who remained faithful and those who awakened in time still tend the sea. Children who hear the whispers are still, one imagines, sent north to Azshj'thul to learn the old disciplines. And that is where the record leaves me uneasy in the end. For the whispers never truly stopped. The sea still speaks to those attuned to hear it, as it has since the first storm song crossed the ocean 27 centuries ago. Somewhere in that gray and wind-swept valley, a child is likely learning even now to listen to the water and to trust what it says, because listening is what saved their ancestors, because listening made their people great, because the voice has always been right before. The question the Tidesages never learned to ask did not die with Lord Stormsong. It waits, as such questions do, beneath the sound of the tide, and whether anyone in Stormsong Valley has yet learned to ask it, whether a people can truly unlearn 27 centuries of unquestioning faith, or whether the door simply waits, patient and open, for the next voice patient enough to use it, is not something the chronicles preserve. Some histories close with an answer. This one closes with a silence, and the long sound of water against the rocks, still whispering, still gentle, still waiting to be believed.